Joining me in the studio is Afghan refugee and journalist Mortaza Bebhoudi. Mortaza, thanks for coming in. Your own story is extraordinary. You were working as a photojournalist in Afghanistan. You were forced to leave. You became a refugee. You ended up in the streets of Paris and then finally given shelter at the Maison de la Journaliste. But I want to know, what was the tipping point? When did it become impossible for you to stay in Afghanistan because you were working as a journalist?
Yes, thank you for having me. Since 2011, that I'm working in Afghanistan, the situation of journalists today in Afghanistan is we had the deadliest year last year for Afghan journalists. In 2015, especially after the Afghan election, we were reporting there. I couldn't continue my job.
What happened?
In May 2015, the Taliban they sent us the emails that we reported on the opium traffic, and then they had to leave after that. When I arrived in Paris, day after, with the help of French embassy, we arrived in Paris and we couldn't find the solution to leave and to stay. But we stayed in the Paris streets for 3 months and then in the House of Journalists welcomed us.
And you now have received official refugee status, haven't you, Mortaza? Media freedom is crucial for any democracy, especially for those in developing countries, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. And as I arrived in Paris in November 2015, I saw the Paris attack happen, and I told to myself, wow, I left, I had to leave my country, and now I'm facing the terrorism here in Europe. Of course, we have to support the NGOs working. In Afghanistan, we have the NGOs working on the safety of journalists. We have to support them, and also with the UN action on the safety of journalists and the journalists' rights. It's very important today. We have to support them in order that journalists can report in a safety place.
But of course, being in France, it must be really interesting making the comparison for life in France as a journalist versus what you were experiencing in Afghanistan. Just explain to me how different it is.
How different is that? Actually, I wanted to mention that we cannot understand the reality without local voices and local reporters. What is happening in Afghanistan today, what is happening in Syria. That's why it's important for me to continue my job here in France in order that French citizens and also European citizens understand better the situation in Afghanistan today, as well as we had the deadliest year last in Afghanistan. We lost 10 colleagues. Like 3 days ago, we had a ceremony in Afghanistan, our colleagues. But today, it's very important that those refugee journalists continue the job here in France in order to continue fighting against freedom of press and freedom of expression.
And as we were saying, it's sort of getting the message across to developing countries and governments in that part of the world about how media freedom is essential if you want to have a healthy and flourishing democracy.
It is very essential that, as you mentioned, that without press freedom, we don't have democracy. Today, we see in France with the Yellow Vest movement, today many of journalists that were arrested, and we need to support the first action that we can to support the journalists' rights for the democracy, not the controlled democracy. We need the democracy without control. Today, we have it in France, that since Charlie Hebdo happened, we will have in other countries. But in order to have the journalists' rights and democracy, I think we need to support in international way that, as I mentioned, the UN action on the safety of journalists, supporting the NGOs working with the journalists as well, how journalists can protect themselves in the conflict zone. It is very important.
Mortaza Bebhoudi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.